Good morning, everyone. Hope everyone is having a great day. All right, so what I try to do is to try to simplify complex things for your benefit and my own. And if anybody pays attention, hopefully it helps us become more rational, better voters, better citizens, better educators. It turns out that once you analyze a complex situation well, it often turns out that you actually have something that's very simple. Um, it's it's hard to know exactly why that is the case, but if you think about like physical theorems, like E equals mc squared, I think about it's only a few characters, or F equals ma, force equals mass times acceleration, things like this. It turns out that even though it took a lot of intellectual effort to get there, but once you got there, it seems like, oh, things just click together and they're simple. So the idea behind my website and this page is that I think that philosophers should be a type of servant, and part of that is trying to come up with ways for you to benefit from philosophy without you quitting your job and becoming a philosopher. So basically, my job in this sense is to help you guys out so that you guys don't have to study philosophy and politics and stuff like that. And in many ways, you're not going to be benefited by an entire, devotion in your life to these things. But you do need rules of thumb. You do need some good guidance. You do need some people to lean on that kind of do research that you don't have the time for. And we all do this. I can't read everything. I can't read 100,000 books. I have to use my time judiciously. I have to try to invest my time where it has the most bang for its buck. Okay, that's the background. So the title of this brief talk is Five Steps of a Rational Analysis for Voting, Controversial Issues, and General Thinking. Now, these are really simple, but we often don't actually go through these steps and make these distinctions. We kind of confuse them together, blend them together, and it's kind of melted. And the problem is when they're all blended together, you don't know which one's which. And there's all of these assumptions that kind of bleed together. They're confused. And if there is a problem, it's very hard to understand where the problem is. And that leads to a lot of confusion, arguments, conflict. Okay, step one. Um, diagnostic. Okay, when you go to a doctor, the doctor checks you out, looks at his symptoms, and he tries to diagnose what the problem is. Only after there's a diagnosis do you get a prescription. Now, think about a table. Imagine a table and put some very controversial issues on top of it. Things like racism, abortion, capitalism versus socialism, things like this, things that are very charged and people are arguing about. So think of those types of things and think to yourself, well, why isn't it easier just to figure out which one it is, which side is right? Well, before you can figure out like what side is right, you need to take a step back and just say, well, what is the issue they're arguing about? Especially conservative versus progressive. Most of them diagnose the problem completely different, and as such, they have different prescriptions for it. But one thing is that escapes some people's notice is that both sides, there's well-meaning people trying to solve the problem. So some people, like, they want to solve poverty, but the two different sides diagnose the problem differently, and they have different prescriptions. So it's essential to know that they are going through certain steps, and they could be well-meaning on both sides. Now, if they're voicing contradictory diagnoses, they can't both be right. One of them has to be more right or right, and the other wrong, or both wrong. Okay. But the issue is first take a step back and say, well, what is the diagnosis in the first place? Okay, and that takes some practice to be able to step back. Okay, so first get the diagnosis. Next thing is look at the prescriptions once you have the diagnoses. What are the options? Now, all options are not available, and that's basically the issue of most political issues. They don't have infinite power. They only have certain power, and they only get certain powers from certain sources. So, for instance, if you're talking about taxes, one would have totally different assumptions about what the government's for. Okay, so like the progressive side might assume that they have access to tax dollars. That's a given. That's a starting point. And on the conservative side, that assumption may not be there. For instance, the conservative side would say, well, who owns the money? Well, citizens do. So the only way to get money is to take it first. Okay, it's kind of like only focusing on $1 million, giving it to the poor. Now, would it change the fact that if you stole the money first? Now, there's no doubt that if you give $1 million to a poor person, you take a picture, they'll be smiling when they take the money. There's no doubt about that. But the question is whether they have the money in the first place. That goes back to, a diagnosis prescription issue. You have to separate these issues out, and you can't just assume whatever you want. Otherwise, you'd have basically what we have is modern politics. They just make promises. Everybody's going to have unicorns and flying around with, rainbow and stuff like that. You can't just start with anything you want. It has to be something that is feasible. Like Benjamin Franklin called politics the art of the possible. It has to be in a specific realm. So, step 1, diagnostic. Okay, you have to figure out the problem is. Step 2, based on the diagnosis, you have to look at the prescription. Okay, and we have to see how those are related. If you find out your diagnosis is wrong, that means that your prescription needs to change. Okay. Now, the next step, and in a way, the step 3, theoretical dimensions. In a way, you could say that this might come back, go before diagnosis, but this is a cycle. So think of these steps as cyclical. You go through these steps, and you're always getting new information. If you get some new information about the diagnosis, you're going to amend the definition, reframe the way you think of something. If you study the theoretical underpinnings of these diagnoses and these prescriptions, you're going to change your views. Okay, so 1 is taking steps about the diagnoses. 2, what are the prescriptions? What are the theoretical dimensions that underpin whatever you're talking about? Because sometimes there's actual theories that are just terrible theories. Now, if you have a belief system that's based on a certain theory and you determine that this theory is complete junk, well, you're going to have to make a lot of amendments. You're going to have to modify so many other parts of that system. Okay, so we have to break things down into different dimensions, especially with politics. There's political dimensions, economic dimensions, moral dimensions. Some of these have to do with certain types of theories. Some of it has to do with what simply works, and even if you don't know exactly why. And that brings us to our 4th, historical application. Whenever you're dealing with something, there are some new things, like some new technology. But most of the live issues are, in some ways, perennial issues, like economics. People have been wrestling with economic issues for centuries. And often, people have tried certain things. And if you are advocating for a system that hasn't worked, you need to explain why it didn't work. Or if it does work, why does it work? Okay, so this puts the burden on you actually having to do a bit of history. Now, admittedly, most people don't want to spend much time, but these processes that I'm indicating, these 5 steps, are in a way a test for you to see if you've actually done your research. So if you haven't gone through any of these steps, but you're trying to say that you have thoughtfully considered these things, well, you probably haven't. You just have to be honest about that. All right, so look at the historical applications of whatever you're talking about. If you're talking about racism, you can talk about what has been going on the last century, last couple centuries. What have people said on the topic? Socialism. There are people that call themselves socialists, and they said they were socialists, they had socialist platforms, and the countries did not turn out very well. You need to explain what was right or wrong, and to apply that to whatever you're advocating for. Okay. Likewise, if you're advocating for capitalism, you need to have some historical background. So don't be hasty. Okay. So suspend judgment. Do your due diligence. Okay. Now the last one, current application, presumes you've already done all of these steps, and it's not nice and neat. 1, then 2, then 3. It's kind of like a cycle. You do 1, you do 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. But then it's only then that you apply these things. And that's why it's so shocking about, running into undergrad students that are so sure about so many things. But if you actually ask them pressing questions that would talk about, like, what are the definitions of the terms you're actually using? What's the diagnosis of the problem? why is this prescription better than another prescription? Often they will not be able to answer any of these things. And that's very scary. Okay. So current application is the last step. You should not be making these decisions based on these gut reactions. Don't make these gut reactions. And if you have a gut reaction that's very strong and impassioned, you need to red flag that. Okay, so diagnosis, prescription, look at the theoretical dimensions in the background, historical application, okay, basically what has gone in history relevant to whatever you're talking about. And then last is looking at the current applications of whatever issue, whatever theory, whatever policy that you are advocating for. Okay, so here are some things, rules of thumb to help you go through that process. I encourage you to go through those processes. If you don't, please do not pretend that you have. And it's perfectly fine to say you don't know, or I haven't thought about this. When I have conversations, I often say I don't know. You should be very willing and ready to say those things when it's true. And you should know that these political, ethical, philosophical issues, these are very, very in-depth and elaborate and complicated. Okay, so if you think that it can just be easily, shot from the hip, probably only if you're a very, very brilliant person and you have like an eidetic memory and all of these other amazing gifts, that would be the only time that you should be able to do that. Okay, so here are some 2 rules of thumb that could help you through going through these steps, remembering it's a cycle. Okay, watch for emotional appeals. Like sometimes your emotions track. Sometimes when you're outraged, it actually is something that is, genuinely outrageous. But very often your feelings are complete junk in terms of giving you good information to act on. Okay, so don't trust your feelings. Okay, now is that a comprehensive absolute? No, it's not an absolute statement. But there is the piece of wisdom that your feelings often are liars. You have to just really understand that. You need to take a step back, and that's part of the rational discipline. Yes, this may offend you. You might be wrong. You might be offended because you're being ridiculous or irrational. Okay. So whenever anybody is making an emotional appeal, put a red flag up. Take a step back. Okay. Second, most of it, if you get a lot of your information from the news, now hopefully this is not your primary source of information. Okay, you need to read books. You need to think on your own. You need to have discussions with people that you know and you trust and respect. You should not only get your information from the news, but if you do, okay, watch out for things that I call presumptive characterizations. Okay, if you see language that presumes, insinuates a conclusion about something that really is the issue. So for instance, let's say somebody says something, and there's the issue. Well, what is the implication of this thing? Okay, and there's 2 sides that are arguing about which one it is. If you're looking at a news program that already assumes one side before they have the evidence, well, what is that? That's a prejudice. Okay, it's a judgment that comes before the evidence, so pre-judgment, prejudice. Okay, so anytime that you look at programs that have a lot of adjectives, all of these things that are very loaded language, that have all of these weird, strong connotations, those are red flags. Okay, you want to know that whatever everybody's presenting is something that's fair. Okay, and a fair person knows that they could be wrong, and they want to substantiate whatever they're saying. Okay, so hopefully this was helpful. I hope everybody has a great week. Check out my website for an elaboration of the things that we were talking about. And one last note, controversial issues can actually be invigorating and beneficial to you. So it develops you intellectually, it develops you morally, and it doesn't have to be crazy stressful, okay? But you have to develop yourself a little bit. Just like if you want to lift weights, well, you have to work in the gym, okay? And if you learn the proper technique and you get a lot of benefits, it's more enjoyable, okay? So you guys have a great week, have a great day, and talk to you later.